The British Army's classified Operational Research Review did not circulate widely. It was not the kind of document that appeared in military journals or made its way into the public record of how the war was being fought. But it was read by the generals who were trying to solve the most fundamental tactical problem in Vietnam, and it stated its conclusion with the authority of every Commonwealth counterinsurgency campaign conducted since the Malayan emergency of the early 1950s. Visual tracking ends at nightfall. The review concluded that trackers could not verify their findings in the dark. This was not a tentative assessment. It was the distilled judgment of the officers who had built the world's most effective pursuit capability and who understood with complete professional authority what that capability could and could not do. The darkness was not a tactical problem to be closed with better training or more determined soldiers. It was a property of the discipline itself, as fixed as the terrain it operated in. What that review could not account for, because nobody in any briefing room had yet written it down, was that in the triple-canopy jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province in South Vietnam, a 19-year-old soldier from South Australia named Peter Haran was lying in the dark beside a black Labrador retriever named Caesar, following a trail the doctrine said could not be followed, in conditions the doctrine said made following impossible. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Australian tracker dogs of Vietnam before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question who gets to decide what is impossible. Now let's go. The problem that Peter Haran and Caesar were in the process of solving was not new. It had been the defining tactical failure of every foreign army attempting to fight a guerrilla insurgency in Southeast Asia for the better part of a generation, and it had not been solved by anyone. The French Foreign Legion encountered it first at scale, in the late 1940s and through the early years of the following decade. The Viet Minh refined the tactics that made conventional military superiority functionally irrelevant in dense jungle terrain. They didn't hold ground. They didn't defend positions. They struck with precision and violence, and then they disappeared back into terrain that had been the habitat of their ancestors and that remained as alien to their opponents as the surface of another planet. The Foreign Legion's most experienced jungle fighters were confounded by it. Units that could fight with extraordinary discipline in the open found themselves swinging at an enemy who was already gone before the contact was fully joined. The pattern was not the product of any particular tactical genius. It was the consequence of a fundamental and durable disparity. The insurgent knew the terrain, and the soldiers trying to fight him did not. That disparity produced an enemy who dictated when and where a fight happened, and more critically, how long it lasted. An enemy who could not be fixed, could not be destroyed. An enemy who broke contact at the moment of his own choosing left the opposing force pointing its air power and artillery and armored vehicles at empty jungle. Every technological advantage that the most powerful conventional military in the world possessed was contingent on one thing: knowing where the enemy was. When he chose to vanish, the technology became decoration. The first Australian task force arrived at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 with a doctrine specifically designed to address this problem. Not the American model of large-scale search and destroy operations. The Australians brought the British counterinsurgency approach: small patrols, population protection, intelligence dominance of a defined area of operations. Phuoc Tuy Province had been selected precisely because it was away from the Cambodian border, could be resupplied or evacuated by sea if necessary, and offered a contained geographic environment in which the Australians could demonstrate concentrated results. 8 kilometers north of Baraya, in a rubber plantation that offered at least partial concealment from the rain, the Australians established their base at Nui Dat and began the task of understanding a province the Viet Cong had occupied for years. The terrain was not uniform, and it was not forgiving. The southern parts of the province ran to coastal lowland and rice-growing flatland. Moving north, the rubber plantations gave way to triple-canopy jungle and the complex hill systems of the Nui Dat and Nui Dat ranges. Further north still were the Ma Rung Mountains, which the Viet Cong used as sanctuary, with the confidence of men who knew that nothing from the base at Nui Dat could reach them there without days of warning. The province contained rivers, swamps, laterite ridgelines, and several hundred kilometers of tunnels, whose entrances were invisible from the surface until you were standing on top of them. Every creek crossing was a potential ambush. Every tree line was a potential firing position. The Viet Cong had not merely occupied this terrain. They had been shaping it for years, in specific preparation for the arrival of an enemy they knew would come. The Special Air Service Regiment's role in this environment was to serve as the eyes and ears of the 1st Australian Task Force, to go where infantry battalions could not go in small enough groups to remain unseen, gather intelligence, observe enemy movement, and report what was out there. They operated in 5-man patrols, inserted by helicopter into areas the enemy believed were safe, living in the jungle for days at a time, making contact on their terms or avoiding it altogether, depending on the mission requirement. The SUSAR could find the enemy. What it could not do, and what no element in the force at Nui Dat could do with any reliability, was maintain contact with an enemy who chose to break it. The Viet Cong timed their withdrawals with the methodical precision of men who had studied the pattern of pursuit operations and understood exactly what they could count on. They knew that aggressive follow-up would continue for a specific period, at a specific pace, in specific conditions. They understood, above all, that darkness would end it. That knowledge, that darkness, provided a guaranteed exit from any contact they chose to end, was not incidental to their operational planning. It was foundational. The Viet Cong dispersed into the jungle at the moment of their own choosing, reassembled at prearranged points after an interval calibrated to the speed of pursuit, and returned to operations with a regularity that the inability to follow them after nightfall made possible. They had banked on this. They spent it every day. And what the Viet Cong could not know, because nobody had done it yet, was that the capability that would eventually pursue them into the dark was being assembled in a pound in Sydney. The British had been thinking about the pursuit problem since 1950, when communist insurgents in Malaya began assassinating plantation owners with weapons left over from the wartime resistance against Japan, and the peacetime colonial administration found itself with a crisis it had no adequate tool to address. What arrived to assess the situation was a former Special Air Service officer named Major Michael Calvert, known among his contemporaries as Mad Mike, in the way military cultures reserve for officers of exceptional aggression and demonstrated capability. Calvert went into the jungle, assessed what the insurgency was doing and what the available British forces could plausibly do in response, and came back with a 2-part answer. The first part was hearts and minds, small British units embedded with village populations, providing medical support and protection, depriving the insurgency of the civilian base it depended on. The second part was what mattered for Phuoc Tuy Province in 1967. Hunter-killer teams that took the war to the enemy in the terrain he believed made him untouchable. The combat tracker team that emerged from Calvert's concept was the product of deliberate design, each element chosen for a documented operational reason. A visual tracker was the team's intelligence element, a soldier trained through months of specific instruction to read the physical signs of human passage in a way that produced military-grade information about who had passed and when and in what condition. A skilled visual tracker could determine from a set of footprints the number of individuals who had made them, their approximate load weight, their pace, The direction and time elapsed since passage, whether any were wounded, and from sufficiently experienced practitioners, the sex of the individuals, and the type of weapons they carried. A dog handler with a trained Labrador retriever provided the pursuit capability the visual tracker alone could not guarantee on difficult ground. The ability to follow a scent trail across surfaces that left no visible sign, through water crossings and across hard laterite that carried no footprint, into terrain that the human eye could not read at all. A cover man, a radio man, and a team leader completed the element. 5 people, 2 complementary capabilities, and a mission that had proved unsolvable until this particular combination was tried. The choice of the Labrador Retriever was specific and deliberate. The British had experimented with other breeds. Bloodhounds could follow a scent, but they announced their approach loudly enough to warn the quarry. The Labrador was quiet in the field, even-tempered enough to accept changes in handlers without the operational disruption that plagued more bonded breeds, capable of following a human scent trail for 15 or more kilometers, and patient enough to sustain focus through hours of slow movement through dense terrain. A good tracking Labrador was, by training and temperament, a sensor that could operate in conditions no human eye could match and no technology then available could replicate. Susan Merritt, the author of the most comprehensive history of the American Combat Tracker Program, later wrote that the British had figured out how to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. The system was used in Malaya, Borneo, Brunei, Kenya, Cyprus, and across several decades of British counterinsurgency operations, with a consistency of result that its creators found entirely predictable. The British Jungle Warfare School at Johore Bahru in Malaysia codified the approach and taught it to Allied forces with the uncompromising thoroughness of an institution that believed in what it had built. Trainees arrived in civilian clothes on State Department passports, instructed to bring nothing that identified their national military, wearing British uniforms and gear throughout the course. Attrition rates ran between 35% and 69%. The school's philosophy was delivered on the first day. By the time trainees left, they would know everything the instructors knew. What the school also taught, with equal confidence and equal authority, was what the system could not do. Visual tracking is the ability to read the physical signs of human passage, footprints, disturbed vegetation, compressed foliage, blood trail, discarded material. It requires the human eye, and the eye requires light. The operational research review that circulated to American commanders stated the limit directly, drawing on 15 years of Commonwealth tracking experience. Darkness made the visual tracker's skill inoperable, and the doctrine was built around that constraint. This was not a complaint or an admission of embarrassment. It was a description of a property of the discipline, acknowledged as openly by the people who had built the system as by anyone who studied it from outside. The British knew exactly what they had built. They knew exactly where it stopped. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment came into existence on the 25th of July, 1957, as the first Special Air Service Company under Major W. Gook, with an initial strength of 180 men and an institutional identity that the broader Australian Army regarded with the wariness organizations reserve for things they cannot categorize. It wore a red beret that identified it as a parachute formation because no agreed alternative had emerged. The SAS Association's own history was direct about the regiment's early standing. Raised in 1957 during communist subversion in Southeast Asia, the small and little understood SAS was seen as the ugly duckling of the Australian Army. By the 20th of August, 1964, it was a full regiment with 3 Sabre squadrons, a training squadron, and a headquarters, based at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, Western Australia, and modeled deliberately on the British SAS at Hereford. That modeling meant the Australian regiment absorbed not just the British organizational structure and selection philosophy, but the British operational approach, the patience of small units in denied territory, the fieldcraft that made 5 men more consequential than 50, the willingness to live in the jungle rather than move through it on the way to somewhere else. The proving ground came in 1965 and 66 in Borneo, where the Australian SAS deployed in support of British forces during Indonesian confrontasi, living in the jungle for months, learning to track the enemy and lay ambushes and defeat the Indonesian special forces on the specific terrain those forces had spent years preparing. 3 men died in Borneo, none from direct enemy contact, which is a measurable and specific testimony to the quality of their fieldcraft. In 1966, when the regiment was given permission to adopt the beige beret that would distinguish it from the red bereted parachute companies, most of the regiment was in Borneo and could not be issued the new beret in time. What arrived for them were British SAS berets, the cloth-winged dagger emblem of the regiment at Hereford. The Australians wore British gear in Borneo while developing capabilities that would eventually go beyond what the British had built. It is a detail that captures the whole of the relationship in a single image. 3rd Squadron was the first to deploy to Vietnam, arriving at Vung Tau on the 16th of June, 1966, and moving to Nui Dat the following day. Over 9 months, they conducted 134 patrols and tried and tested many of the techniques that subsequent squadrons would inherit and refine. The enemy's assessment of them was delivered without diplomatic qualification. A female former Viet Cong combatant, interviewed for the History Channel's authorized documentary on the SSR, stated that the VC were not afraid of the American GIs, the Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. They hated the Australian SS Rangers because they made comrades disappear. The NVA and Viet Cong had a name for the Australians: Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. What the phantoms of the jungle could not yet do was follow a disappearing enemy into darkness. They could find him and observe him and document his supply routes and his order of battle with a precision that no other element in the force could match. They could not maintain contact once he chose to break it, in the specific conditions of darkness, heavy rain, and heavily trafficked ground that stripped the surface of readable sign. The limitation was not a failure of skill or nerve. It was the boundary the British had built into the system's honest self-assessment, within which every Allied force in Southeast Asia found itself constrained. At the same time that 3rd Squadron was conducting its first patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province, a 19-year-old from South Australia was completing his infantry training in preparation for a very different assignment. And in a dog pound in Sydney, a black Labrador cross of no particular distinction was waiting to be collected. The tracking wing was established at the Ingleburn Infantry Centre in New South Wales as a subunit of the School of Infantry, a modest institutional footprint for a capability that would prove more consequential than anyone at Ingleburn in 1966 had fully anticipated. The specific choice of black Labrador retrievers was not random. Their dark coloring provided camouflage in jungle terrain. It also, in a decision that was either precisely calculated or fortuitously correct, depending on who made it and when, provided camouflage at night. The British dogs in Malaya and Borneo had not been selected on the basis of color. The Australians were selecting for a different environment, and part of that environment was darkness. The dogs were acquired from specialist breeders and Sydney dog pounds, screened for temperament and trainability, and matched with handlers selected for the combination of patience and physical endurance the program demanded. Caesar came from a Sydney pound in 1966. He was a black Labrador Kelpie cross, and his first assessment by the Army did not single him out as exceptional. His handler was Private Peter Haran, who joined the program at 19 years of age and would spend the rest of his active service life trying to separate what he knew from what Caesar had taught him. Haran later described Caesar as not the prettiest dog he had ever seen, but by far the finest tracker dog ever trained at the School of Infantry. The training program that bound them together ran for 10 months, beginning with basic obedience and the careful construction of the handler-dog relationship. Not a secondary concern, but the operational mechanism the program depended on, because a handler who did not know his dog could not read his dog, and a handler who could not read his dog could not turn the animal's behavior into military intelligence. From there, it moved through desensitization to the stimuli of combat. Gunfire, explosions, helicopters, the sustained noise and movement of operational environments designed to produce exactly the physiological stress responses that ruin a tracking dog's focus. South Vietnamese soldiers were used to lay scent trails during the training period, so that the dogs became accustomed to following specifically Asian scent signatures before they arrived in Vietnam. The trainers were not preparing these animals to track Europeans in Australian bush. They were preparing them to track Vietnamese in Vietnamese jungle, and the distinction was important enough to address from the beginning. The helicopter harness was developed specifically for the Australian operational environment. The British tracking program in Malaya and Borneo used ground insertion. In Vietnam, a contact in triple-canopy jungle could occur kilometers from any accessible route, in terrain that would take hours to reach on foot, hours during which the scent was aging, the sign was degrading, and the enemy was putting distance between himself and the last known point of contact. The Australians developed a harness allowing a tracker dog to be winched into or out of a jungle landing zone by helicopter. Teams could be airlifted to a fresh track within minutes of a contact, getting dog and handler and visual tracker onto the scent precisely at the moment when the combined capability was most effective. Cassius was one of the 2 first trial tracker dogs to arrive in South Vietnam. He was approximately 1 year old. On the 12th of May, 1967, 6 weeks into his deployment, he died from heat exhaustion during a training run in the sand dunes around Vung Tau. Vietnam simply killed him, as it killed many things that had not been adapted specifically enough for what it actually was. He was the only Australian tracker dog to die on duty, and his death was not the product of enemy action or any specific operational hazard. It was the environment itself. He was replaced by Tiber, who arrived later that same month and would carry the story of what these animals were asked to endure into a chapter that nobody at Ingleburn had planned for. The team structure that emerged from the program took a form that remained consistent throughout the campaign. 2 dogs and 2 handlers, 2 visual trackers, a machine gunner, and a signaller. 2 dogs were assigned to each infantry battalion at Nui Dat, operating on standby. When an infantry patrol made contact and the enemy broke away, the tracker team was airlifted to the contact point. The dogs also demonstrated, almost immediately, a capability nobody had formally incorporated into the operational planning. They detected mines and booby traps. They had not been trained to do this, but dogs focused enough to follow a specific human scent through triple-canopy jungle proved capable of registering the buried and concealed objects the Viet Cong placed along approach routes. 3 of the 11 Australian tracker dogs would be credited with 5 or more enemy kills, not through any act of direct violence, but through the contacts their tracking made possible that would not otherwise have been made. Private Robert Pearson, serving with the 9th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, did not go into the jungle thinking about doctrine. He went with Julian, who was a black Labrador of somewhat uncertain temper, and who had, by the standards of the combined tracker team, become a known quantity to the men who worked beside him. when a Delta Company patrol discovered a bunker system in very thick jungle and made contact with 2 Viet Cong, one of whom was wounded. Pearson and Julian were airlifted to the contact point and put on the blood trail. Julian followed it for approximately 150 to 200 meters through the bunker system, moving with the focused intensity a good tracking dog brings to a fresh blood trail until the heat and density of the environment collapsed him in exhaustion beneath a tree. Pearson and his coverman stayed with Julian. The visual tracker crawled up alongside them. 3 men lay on the edge of the track, reading the ground for sign. Pearson looked up the track. 7 or 8 meters away was a claymore mine pointing directly at them. The lieutenant pulled the team out. Centurion tanks were called forward to destroy the bunker system. Julian recovered. Pearson described the experience as the worst tracking day he had ever known, one that he believed would be his last. He said that boredom would set in for weeks at a time, and then you go out, and within a couple of hours, you feel like your life is almost over. Julian's performance in that bunker system was precisely what the combined team had been designed to deliver. He had tracked in daylight, on a blood trail that was fresh and strong, in conditions the established doctrine had specified as within the system's operational range. The next time Pearson and Julian went out, the conditions were not those conditions. A lieutenant from Charlie Company had observed that Julian was trained not to bark, and on that basis decided it would be operationally sound to include Pearson and Julian in a night ambush. Pearson and Julian found themselves in the kill zone on the left-hand flank, on a very well-used track, in very thick jungle, in complete darkness. The ambush was set. At 4 in the morning, Pearson was woken by automatic fire a few feet away, groping for a dog he could not see. The left flank assignment itself was significant beyond its immediate context. A trained tracking dog placed in darkness because his silence was a tactical asset. The doctrine had described what he could not do in the dark. The doctrine had not accounted for what his stillness and his directional alerting could accomplish in the dark, which was not nothing. Peter Haran's own experience with Caesar across 12 months in Phuoc Tuy Province was building the same understanding from a different direction. The handler-dog relationship that the training program at Ingleburn had constructed was not merely a functional pairing. It was the development of a specific language between 2 organisms, one of which communicated entirely in behavior. A visual tracker reading the ground was reading a fixed record: the compressed soil, the displaced leaf, the blood that had dried on bark at a specific height. Haran was reading something different in Caesar, a real-time intelligence feed, continuously updated, whose currency did not depend on light. The language was the dog's body. The lowering of the head meant one thing. The shift in the animal's focus toward a specific bearing meant another. The particular stillness that a working Labrador holds when its senses are fully engaged with something the human beside it cannot yet detect was a signal as precise and as readable as any visual sign once you knew the animal well enough to read it. The mechanics of why this worked had always existed in the combined team's design, but had not been fully understood because they hadn't been fully tested under the pressure of operational necessity. Visual tracking is a skill of the eye, and the eye requires light. A trained visual tracker in complete darkness is a trained soldier lying in the jungle waiting for morning. The dog's scenting capability has no equivalent dependency. The Labrador follows a human scent through darkness as readily as through daylight, across hard laterite ground that carries no visual sign as readily as across soft soil that leaves a clear impression, through rain and humidity that ages scent but does not eliminate it within the operational window of a follow-up. The skill the Australian handlers were developing, not in any training exercise, not through any planned experiment, but through the accumulative pressure of needing to do something and finding that it could be done, was the ability to use the dog's behavioral responses as a primary intelligence source in conditions where the ground itself provided nothing readable. Not daylight only, not the hours the doctrine allowed, by day and by night, in the dark, on ground that left no sign. The discovery did not announce itself. It accumulated through specific experiences. A night ambush here, a contact that extended past sunset there. The accumulated evidence of a capability being tested by operational necessity in conditions that training at Ingleburn had not specifically prepared anyone for. Haran later described the specific quality of working with Caesar in reduced light. The way the dog's lead became an information source when the eyes had nothing to offer. The way a shift in tension or direction could replace the visual sign that darkness had erased. The way 2 years of working a specific animal in specific conditions produced a fluency in an animal's behavior that was as precise and as military as anything a visual tracker read in footprints. The established doctrine had described 2 capabilities working in parallel. What Haran and Caesar and the other handler dog pairs in Phuoc Tuy Province were discovering was that the 2 capabilities could merge into something different in character from either one. A pursuit system that worked when the eyes could not, using as its primary sensor an animal that had been selecting through darkness for most of the history of its species. Major Reginald Beasley, who commanded 3rd Squadron on its 2nd tour and who kicked down the kills boards that earlier squadrons had erected to track their victories, insisted that the squadron was there to gather information, not to kill. What the combined tracker team was proving in the left flank of a night ambush in Phuoc Tuy Province, in the tunnels and bunker systems where Julian had tracked a wounded man before collapsing, in the accumulated operational evidence of 2 years of sustained deployment, was that the combined team could gather information in conditions the doctrine had declared beyond the system's reach. The post-operational reports from the Vietnam campaign were formal institutional documents, not memoirs or impressions formed in the field and later softened by distance. When those reports codified what the tracker teams had demonstrated, they stated it with the compressed precision of military staff work. Tracking skills were required by day and night. 3 words, where British doctrine had used none, because British doctrine had not considered night to be within the system's operational range. Those 3 words are not a modification of what the British had built. They are the institutional record of what the Australians had discovered. Tybor found out in a more violent way that the darkness was no longer a protection for either side. During the Viet Cong assault on Fire Support Base Coral in 1968, a rocket-propelled grenade detonated a few feet away from him. He survived. He did not survive it undamaged. From that day forward, Tybor was gun-shy in ways his handlers could manage but not cure, sometimes jumping whimpering into ditches when Australian artillery fired, sometimes freezing in the presence of sounds that were operationally unavoidable. He was approximately 2 years old when the grenade detonated beside him. The Melbourne Herald, on the 10th of May, 1969, described him as a shell-shocked digger who would be in Vietnam until he died. He was Private Tybor, a black Labrador tracker dog. The word digger was not a metaphor. It was an acknowledgement that Tybor had been where diggers went and had paid the price diggers paid. The operational record of the tracker teams was not ambiguous about what they had contributed. The officer commanding the tracking team wrote the program's definitive assessment in 1968, concluding that the combat tracker team provided a surveillance capability that could not be replaced by any other means in the terrain conditions of Southeast Asia, and that if the teams were skillfully employed against the Viet Cong, many lucrative targets would be acquired for destruction by air-mobile infantry. Not the best available option, not a useful supplement, the only effective weapon for pursuing the Viet Cong into the areas they believed made them safe. That assessment emerged from a specific and sustained accumulation of results. The Special Air Service Regiment conducted approximately 1,200 to 1,400 combat patrols over the course of its 5-year Vietnam deployment. Against those patrols, it sustained 1 soldier killed in action, 1 who died of wounds, 3 killed in accidents, and 1 missing in action. 28 were wounded. Against those casualties, it inflicted approximately 500 to 600 confirmed enemy deaths. No other Australian unit in Vietnam operated at a comparable ratio, and no comparable ratio existed elsewhere in the Allied force structure. The enemy was sufficiently aware of this asymmetry to respond to it. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army placed a bounty on the 5-man tracker teams and their Labrador retrievers. In a country where the Americans were deploying 50,000 soldiers, these particular 5-man elements and their dogs warranted specific financial incentives to kill. A bounty is a precise measurement, not of any abstract quality, but of how thoroughly the combined team had disrupted the assumption on which the enemy's operational planning had depended. Caesar's contribution to that record was distributed across 3 years and 4 handlers. He served with the 2nd Royal Australian New Zealand Regiment under Peter Haran in 1967 and 68, then with the 1st, the 5th, and finally the 7th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment until his retirement in September of 1970. He was approximately 4 years old at retirement, old for a working dog at operational tempo in a tropical climate. He had outlasted his 1st handler, and his 2nd, and his 3rd. The official war artist Ken McFadyen, who recorded the faces and moments of the Australian campaign in South Vietnam for the permanent collection of the Australian War Memorial, chose Caesar as the subject of a portrait. Not the commanding officer of a squadron, not a recipient of a military cross. A black Labrador from a Sydney pound, whose image hangs in the National Collection alongside the other visual records of what the Australian Army did in Phuoc Tuy Province. The American forces who trained alongside the Australian and New Zealand SAS instructors brought back to Vietnam the most precisely evaluated external assessment of the combined team. Combat Tracker Team 9, attached to the 101st Airborne Division in October of 1967, went through the division's standard evaluation process for new elements, a process that every unit joining the 101st was required to complete before being trusted with operational responsibility. The evaluation stopped on the first day. The 101st Airborne were the Screaming Eagles, a formation whose professional assessments were not softened by courtesy. Their verdict on Combat Tracker Team 9 was direct. The teams already knew more than the division could teach them, and the evaluation course was unnecessary. The Viet Cong's own operational adaptation to the tracker teams was itself a measurement of the capability's significance. By 1970, Viet Cong insurgents had studied Australian helicopter insertion techniques closely enough to fire on SASR patrols shortly after their landing. The Australians responded with what they called the cowboy insertion. A second helicopter carrying a second patrol following the first, both inserting together, the second waiting in place while the first moved out, then extracting if no contact threatened the first. The innovation and counter-innovation spiral between the SASR and the Viet Cong across 5 years of sustained operations in Phuoc Tuy Province produced, on both sides, a progressive sophistication in understanding what the other could do and how that capability could be degraded. The bounty placed on the teams and their dogs was the enemy's formal acknowledgement of the disruption the combined team had caused. The first day of training at the British Jungle Warfare School at Johore Bahru opened with an announcement from an instructor whose rank was not displayed and whose name was not used. The American trainees in the room found his accent barely comprehensible. Their New Zealand SAS instructor directed the group in formation with the words, "Lightly on your toes, right wheel, go." The Americans stared at each other. He repeated himself. They continued to stare. He resorted to sign language, directing them into a column right that their military training had perfectly prepared them to execute in any language, except the one being used. The school's very first lesson, delivered before a single track had been laid or a dog introduced to its handler, was that what the Americans were about to learn had not been developed with American assumptions in mind. The political architecture around the school was as carefully constructed as the training itself. The United Kingdom had not entered the Vietnam War. It had been publicly critical of American involvement, while acknowledging privately the strategic consequences of a communist consolidation of Southeast Asia. The school in Johore Bahru was in Malaysia, which had also maintained formal neutrality. Trainees arrived in civilian clothes on State Department passports, instructed to bring nothing that identified their national military, and wore British uniforms and equipment throughout. No identifying badges, names rarely used. The secrecy was not incidental. It was as operationally critical as anything taught on the training ground itself. The training was constructed on the philosophical foundation that had produced the original system in Malaya. If the environment is difficult enough in training, the operational environment becomes manageable by comparison. Attrition rates among American trainees ran between 35 and 69%. Trainees carried packs heavier than 100 pounds. They ran hills with other soldiers on their backs. Gurkhas, directed by the New Zealand SAS instructors, played the enemy in mock contacts with a commitment to realism that included appearing from concealment at ambushes and shouting that the students were all dead. One New Zealand SAS instructor, placing demolition charges around a large tree adjacent to a training route to create a realistic contact simulation, slightly overcalculated the explosive load, detonated it from concealment, and was knocked out of the tree along with the tree. He was retrieved from the wreckage less damaged than his dignity. The Australians and their New Zealand SAS colleagues brought to Johore Bahru something the British template had not anticipated: the accumulated operational experience of 2 years in Phuoc Tuy Province. Not the theoretical framework the British had developed in Malaya, but the specific modifications that Vietnam had demanded and that the system had been found, in operational conditions, to provide. The combined simultaneous approach, dog and visual tracker, working as a single unified element from the moment of insertion, was one contribution. The helicopter winch insertion was another. And the extended operational window, the demonstrated capacity for the combined team to maintain effective pursuit in conditions of reduced visibility and darkness that the established doctrine had described as beyond the system's range, was the third. It was the contribution the doctrine had explicitly stated was impossible. Assembled together, those 3 contributions created a capability that could be deployed at night, on difficult ground, within minutes of a contact, and maintain productive intelligence gathering in conditions that an enemy had designed its entire post-contact behavior to exploit. The founding British system had broken the guerrilla's assumption that terrain and camouflage made him invisible during the day. The Australian modification broke his assumption that darkness provided the exit. An enemy who cannot guarantee that darkness will stop his pursuers must either stop moving at night, surrendering the initiative that guerrilla doctrine depends on, or accept that the period he had considered safe is no longer safe. That shift in the tactical calculus was the specific knowledge that the Australians taught at Johore Bahru, and that the American trainees, and through them, the South Vietnamese, and through the Fort Gordon School, the broader U.S. Army, absorbed into their own operational understanding, 2nd Squadron SASR provided instructors to the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Wing at Van Keep in Baria, where South Vietnamese soldiers were trained in the techniques that were supposed to sustain the war effort after the Australian and American withdrawal that everyone understood, by 1969, was coming. 2 years after the Johore Bahru program had begun, the United States Army established its own combat tracker team school at Fort Gordon in Georgia, running it under an advisory panel of 4 SAS soldiers and a veterinarian from the Royal Army Veterinary Corps. The school ran until 1970, when the drawdown of the American commitment made its continuation difficult to justify. The knowledge built at Johore Bahru and Fort Gordon and Van Keep and the Ingleburn Tracking Wing was a specific body of understanding about how to maintain contact with an enemy who believed that darkness and terrain made him beyond pursuit. By the time the last Australian combat troops prepared to leave Vietnam in 1971, that knowledge was distributed across thousands of trained soldiers and dozens of Labrador retrievers. It existed in the operational memories of 4 Allied militaries, in the doctrine of 7 years of sustained combat, and in the bodies and accumulated experience of 11 black dogs living in kennels at Nui Dat. The handler-dog bond was not a sentimental byproduct of the program. It was the operational mechanism that made the program work. A tracking dog's proximity alerts, the specific changes in body posture and movement that communicated distance, direction, and urgency of the quarry, are not legible to a human observer who does not know the specific animal producing them. A new handler working with an experienced tracker dog reads general behavior and misses the particular signals that an experienced handler converts into tactical decisions. When Peter Haran's 1-year tour ended and he left Vietnam in 1968, Caesar did not leave with him. The policy was not concealed. The Australian Army's position was that quarantine costs, the length of the dog's tours, and the administrative complexity of repatriating working animals made the return of the tracker dogs impractical. The operational consequences of that position were equally clear. The new handler who received Caesar after Haran's departure needed months to develop the specific fluency with that dog's signals that Haran had spent a year building. An American handler who had trained alongside Australian and New Zealand SAS instructors and had watched multiple handler transitions later observed that when a dog was said to be performing poorly, the real issue was almost always the first handler who had the dog, not the animal itself. It was not a sentimental objection to the policy. It was a professional observation about the operational cost of a decision the institution had made on administrative grounds. Caesar served with 4 handlers across 3 years. Haran left him with the 2nd Royal Australian New Zealand Regiment when his tour ended in '68. From there, Caesar passed to the 1st, then the 5th, then the 7th Royal Australian Regiment, outlasting each handler by months until his retirement in September of 1970. He was rehomed at the British Embassy in Saigon. Peter Haran, who had returned to Australia and subsequently served a 2nd tour as a tracker handler before leaving the Army in 1972, wasn't in Saigon when Caesar was retired. Caesar was not in Australia when Haran was. What happened to Caesar on the 30th of April, 1975, when North Vietnamese forces entered Saigon, is not recorded anywhere in the available documentation. Tiber's final chapters are shorter and no less clear. He remained in Vietnam throughout, permanently altered by the rocket-propelled grenade at Fire Support Base Coral, still operationally capable despite the gun-shyness that had become a permanent condition of working with him. He did not come home. His last verified location was Nui Dat. The Melbourne Herald had described him on the 10th of May, 1969, as a shell-shocked digger who would be in Vietnam until he died. He was. The fate of the remaining 9 dogs is partially documented and largely unknown. Some were adopted by Australian civilians or foreign nationals remaining in Saigon after the military withdrawal. Most passed into whatever local arrangements could be made for animals in a city that would soon have far more urgent concerns. None of them returned to Australia. The same administrative position that had prevented Caesar from traveling home with Haran never changed. Peter Haran, who became a founding member of the Australian Army Trackers and War Dogs Association after leaving the service, spent the subsequent decades speaking to veterans groups and school audiences about what the Tracker Dog program had accomplished. He described Caesar without sentimentality, always, and never without precision. Not the prettiest dog he had ever seen, but the finest tracker dog the School of Infantry had ever produced, and the finest tracker dog the School of Infantry had decided it could afford to forget. The fate of Australia's war dogs, once their service came to an end in Vietnam, caused consternation in Army circles and anguish to their handlers. The consternation in Army circles resolved, as institutional consternation tends to do, in favor of the position the institution had already taken. The anguish in the handlers did not resolve. It became part of what Vietnam meant to them, not the abstract political failure of the war, not the distant institutional failures of strategy and supply, but the specific and personal fact that the animal who had protected them and the men around them, and who they had learned to trust completely, was not worth the cost of a quarantine period to bring home. The tracking wing at the Ingleburn Infantry Center was closed when Australia's involvement in Vietnam ended in 1971. The infrastructure was dismantled. The program was not placed in reserve or held in inactive status for future contingencies. It was ended. The knowledge built across 5 years of operational deployment now resided in individuals who were leaving the service, carrying in their professional memories a capability the institution had decided it no longer needed. The post-operational reports from Vietnam were formal staff documents written by commanding officers who had watched the tracker teams operate. The majority of those commanding officers recommended cross-training infantry platoons for tracking and reconnaissance, tracking skills for all infantry riflemen, with emphasis on the reading of sign by day and night, and the reintroduction of the combined tracker team as a standing capability. Those recommendations were filed. They were not implemented. In 1993, Australia deployed forces to Somalia as part of Operation Solace. The post-operational report that emerged recommended formal tracking training for at least 2 members of each rifle section, and that all snipers be tracking qualified. The tracking wing at Ingleburn had been closed for 22 years. The recommendation coming out of Africa echoed the recommendation that had come out of Asia a generation earlier, because the soldiers who wrote the Somalia report were not historians. They were soldiers who had encountered a problem in the field and were trying to describe its solution in the institutional language available to them. They did not know, could not have known, that the solution they were recommending had already existed and had already been discarded. East Timor produced similar recommendations. Each new operational environment rediscovered the same requirement from near institutional zero. Each time, the infrastructure to meet it had been allowed to decay, and the time required to rebuild it was time that the operational environment didn't offer. A tracker dog program is not an equipment acquisition. It cannot be reconstituted by purchasing replacement hardware. It requires sustained years of training, the slow construction of handler-dog relationships, and the kind of institutional memory that only exists in individuals who have done it before and who are still in the service and willing to teach. By the time of Somalia, those individuals were gone. David Barrell is an infantry officer with more than 20 years of service, who wrote an article published in the Australian Army's professional journal, The Cove, under the title, The Emergence of Combined Technologies, establishment of a combat tracking unit. He was Wing Sergeant Major of the Combat Command Wing at the time of writing. His argument, assembled from post-operational reports across Vietnam, Somalia, and East Timor, was that the available evidence justified a dedicated combat tracking unit with organic canine capability, a unit that would do on a permanent institutional basis what the tracker teams at Nui Dat had done across 5 years of operational deployment. The fact that this article needed to be written, that a serving officer in the 21st century needed to make the case from first principles for a capability that post-operational reports had recommended after 3 separate deployments over 30 years, is the specific measure of what was lost when the tracking wing closed in 1971. By the time of Operation Iraqi Freedom, American Special Operations Forces were reconstructing, from near institutional zero, a tracking capability that had been demonstrated at operational scale in Vietnam and then dismantled in the drawdown that followed. The capability was not expensive to maintain. It was extraordinarily expensive to rebuild. Every time it had to be rebuilt, the soldiers who had built it the first time were older, or out of the service, or gone. There was a life-size bronze sculpture of a black Labrador retriever near the railway station at Edmondson Park in Sydney's southwest. It was commissioned as part of the development of a new suburb built on land that had once been the Ingleburn Army Camp, where the tracking wing trained the dogs and handlers of the Vietnam Tracker program. The sculpture depicts Caesar. Peter Haran was present for the unveiling. It is the only public memorial to the Tracker dog program in Australia. It is not in Canberra. Cassius was approximately 1 year old when he died from heat exhaustion in the sand dunes at Vung Tau on the 12th of May, 1967. He did not come home to Ingleburn. Tiber was approximately 2 years old when the rocket-propelled grenade detonated beside him at Fire Support Base Coral and left him gun-shy for the remainder of his service. He did not come home. Caesar was approximately 4 years old when he was retired to the British Embassy in Saigon. He did not come home to the city whose pound had sold him. The men who worked beside them did come home, most of them, and spent subsequent years trying to explain what had been accomplished in a jungle in Southeast Asia, with 5-man patrols and black dogs, and the particular knowledge that the darkness wasn't as final as the doctrine said. What was accomplished was this. The British had built a system that was genuinely remarkable, and that contained, written into its design, an honest statement of what it could not do. The Australians took that system into an operational environment that punished its stated limit every day, and they found, through the accumulated pressure of specific situations demanding specific responses, that the limit the doctrine had described as fixed was not fixed at all. The combined team worked in darkness. The combined team worked in rain and on ground that left no visual sign, in conditions that stripped the visual tracker of every tool his skill depended on, and the dog's capabilities continued to function regardless. They demonstrated this operationally. They taught it at Johore Bahru and Fort Gordon and Van Keep. They changed what the word impossible meant in the counterinsurgency doctrine of an alliance, in a way that was never officially named or assigned to a specific person or a specific date, or recorded on any monument in any capital city. The distance between what was accomplished in that jungle and what was preserved of it is not a distance that diminishes with time. David Barrell is still making the argument. The bronze at Edmondson Park is still the only memorial. And the 11 black dogs selected partly for the color that made them harder to see in the dark, the color chosen by people who were already thinking about the hours after the light failed, already planning for the thing the doctrine said could not be done, are not collectively commemorated anywhere that the public visits. If you believe those men and those animals deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand what happens when soldiers know something their institutions refuse to learn, watch this next.